You will bring balance to your tank. You will learn the ways of the Planted Aquarius. I'm wearing a towel on my head. This is ridiculous. Balance your tank. What exactly does that mean? And when someone says, I'm getting algae, something's happening in my tank, I don't know what's wrong with my plants, we always reply with, well, balance your tank. Fix your balance to your tank. Well, what exactly does that mean? What do we mean by that? Well, I'm going to tell you right now. It is our lazy layman way to tell you to fix your shit. Now, before I explain myself and we go on, this channel is all about aquariums. And if you're new here and you want to learn more about aquariums and you want to discuss aquariums, hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you know when I make new videos, as well as do live streams. And of course, if you're one of my awesome subscribers, hit that like button and leave a comment and share wherever you can. So we're going to talk about tank balance and what we mean or what I mean when I say that or when we say that, especially if you're new to planted tanks. Now, a lot of this relates to understanding how plants grow, and that basically means understanding photosynthesis. So if you haven't already, hit that button right there, go watch a video about photosynthesis and understand the process of it. Now, this is important because we have to understand the three major factors of growing aquarium plants, which I mentioned in all my videos. Now, when we say balance your tank, we're talking about something is off in one of those three major factors, and it does kind of relate to each other. Now, just remember this is the very important thing to remember. Balancing your tank means that to grow healthy plants, growing plants that's doing really well in the aquarium. It's not about getting rid of algae. Now, when something goes out of whack, your plant growth is stunted, or something is happening where your plants are not doing well. Either it's dying or it's just stopped growing as well as it should be growing in your tank. And that leads to this simple answer of, hey, just balance your tank. And when we say that, that means there's something off, so let's readjust it so your plants can go back to grow the way they were growing. It is very hard to explain because now some people are saying, oh, it's how to do it, it's how to, and there's a lot of misconceptions out there in the aquarium hobby world because there's so much conflicting information based on a lot of people's experience and a lot of assumptions. Now, I'm not saying I'm right either. All the stuff is what I've learned, what I've gleaned from when doing all these planted tank stuff. So we're gonna go ahead and try to shuffle through all that misconception and just kind of go with what I understand and what I've learned. And also keep in mind that to understand balance, you also have to understand how much plants are you growing in your tank. That's considered plant load, and also what type of plants, because all plants are different in a way that we are different as well. Some need more lighting, some don't need more lighting, some produces photosynthesis faster than others. So you got to keep that in mind. There are a lot of variables. So let's go into it really quick and go over the three major factors I was talking about and just kind of understand how that affects your tank. The first thing we're going to have to talk about is light. Light is one of the major factors that I talk about, and it's also what kind of drives the growth of your plants based on how much energy it's going to produce photosynthesis. And that usually relates to the potential light that you're giving it. The potential light you're giving it. The potential light you're giving it. Now, that's important to understand because a lot of people think that because the light is really bright to our eyes, that means that it's going to be really bright for the plants. That is a huge misconception. That's not how it works. But we will go into that later in a later video. But just to understand that light and having good light isn't about how bright it is. The most important thing we have to look at light is how it's manufactured, how the mix of bulbs are in the light itself, because we have to give plants the right spectrum to grow and produce photosynthesis. And one last thing I want you to keep in mind is also K rating. A lot of people come up to say, well, this is the light I got, will it grow plants? It's 20 watts at 6,500 kelvins. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions in our hobby is that everyone's based everything on Kelvin rating. Kelvin rating is just the hue or the color of the light. It rarely has to do with anything about growing plants. It has more to do with how we perceive light and the color of light. Okay, so remember is how much potential light we're giving the plants. So that's why we always look into the type of light from certain brands and the type of lights we're going to use. The more important thing is to remember is how the light is producing the spectrum as well as how the light is covering your tank. Depending on the type of light you use, a spotlight is a strip light or what have you, it depends on how the light's being distributed in your tank and the type of tank you have. Again, More advanced topics, we'll go into later about that. But the more important thing to remember in this video is that light leads the balance of what's going on in your tank. The second factor you would think I would talk about would be CO2 in the three major factors. It's not. It's actually nutrients. And nutrients is actually vitally important to the plants. Nutrient promotes photosynthesis, cell development, metabolism, and the way that plants will grow and how sturdy they grow. So it's very important that we provide the plants with all the nutrients it can get. And that again is going to be in the later video, but what you need to know is that there's about 13 nutrients that plants need, and we divide them into macronutrients and micronutrients. And this is why pH is kind of important in a planted tank. The pH will affect the way that plants would be able to take in nutrients. It will affect the nutrients the way that it's going to be given off in the tank, as well as its molecular structure, I guess you can say. I don't know, that's not very scientific, but you have to ask a more scientific person about that. Maybe, I don't know, Mike from AquaPros. But that's something I want you to keep in mind, that the pH does affect the way that how plants will take in nutrients, okay? Now there's a thing that we say, is that when you have an algae bloom and you're asking for help, a lot of us will say, well, you have too much nutrients in your tank. It's partly true, partly false, and I'll explain why. Phosphates and iron is a contributing factor to algae, okay? Other than that, the other factors aren't so important that will cause algae growth. But what does cause algae growth is ammonia. Now, this is why we say don't overfeed your fish, because if you overfeed your fish, it causes ammonia spike, and when the ammonia spikes, then suddenly you will have algae. That is very true, and that's also true that plants do use ammonia, but not the whole part of the ammonia. Again, we'll have to cover this in another video, but just remember that ammonia is what causes algae growth, and ammonia is not actually part of the nutrients that we give to plants. Now, I don't want to get into the scientific stuff in this video, but mainly when we say too much nutrients, it's usually meaning phosphates and iron, and also the production of ammonia in your aquarium. And in saying that, and in assuming that your tank is growing really healthy plants, it's using up those two elements, as well as helping hold down the ammonia so that the algae don't have a chance to use it. Now, CO2. CO2 helps the plants produce photosynthesis to produce the food they need to eat and grow. It is important to mention here, and kind of contradict myself in other videos, is that CO2 is actually a nutrient for the plants. It's not an actual separate thing. But a lot of us consider it a separate thing because of the way that we introduce it into the tank. It's totally different than just dosing regular nutrients. Another great thing about CO2 is that it lowers the pH in the tank, which makes it easier for the plants to manipulate and intake nutrients. So that's a great thing about using CO2. So let's go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room then. I see this a lot, and I hear this a lot, and it's the advice that to get rid of algae, you need CO2. That is actually a misconception. And the biggest misconception is that CO2 inhibits the growth of algae. It does not. Algae, like plants, uses CO2 to produce photosynthesis to grow. But what it does do is promote healthy plant growth, and that is the most important thing that you have to remember here. Assuming that you're giving it enough potential light to grow at the rate that you want it to grow, then you have to provide the CO2 to the plants for it to grow at that speed, if that makes any sense, and we'll get into that in a bit. So those are the important things you got to remember about these three major factors when it comes to balancing your tank. So let's talk about what is balancing your tank, how to balance these things together. Now, before you even think about balancing your tank, you have to understand this: your plant load and the type of plants you're growing. Now, see, I have to say this because a lot of people come up to me and say, well, you know, I got this nice lighting setup, I got, you know, pressurized CO2, and I am EI dosing the tank. I'm like, oh, wow, great. Well, what kind of plants you got and what are you growing? Well, I'm growing, you know, Amazon swords and Anubias and Java ferns. Okay, now, okay, you're trying to drive growth, all right, that might work, but then again, these type of plants can't grow that fast. So all this thing you're providing the plant, all this money you're spending on the tank for the plants is going to be wasted. And you might honestly produce more algae that way because you're just giving it way more stuff than it can actually use. So you need to do your research and understand the type of plants you're going to grow, as well as remember that plant load does affect the balance in your tank. And just in case you don't understand it, plant load is how much plants you have in your tank. So if it's tons of plants in your tank, then you have a huge plant load, barring from any silly puns and jokes. So now that we have that out of the way, and you know what type of light to get if you have high demanding light plants, then you have to have a really good light setup that will provide that potential light to the plant. So now that we know the light that you got and how well it will drive the growth of your plants, we add CO2 and nutrients if we need to. So let me explain it like this. Let's go and bring up a chart, and then we'll talk about the potential lighting and all that stuff and how it balances. This is a very rudimentary way of representing balance of what you are giving to your plants, but it's a great place to start. The meters we see here are simply the level of light energy, the level of CO2, the level of nutrients, and the level of plant growth. To make things simple, we're just going to go and assume that we're talking about a single type of plant and the only plant we have in the aquarium. This plant is a made-up plant, and we'll call it Samplenatherium fictarius. It's a made-up name. It sounds Latin, so we're good. Let's define what low and high light is. For the sake of this video, we're talking about the intensity of the radiation that's hitting the plant rather than the actual brightness. The more we can provide, the more the plant can use for photosynthesis. Let's start high. Let's assume that we're giving all the light the plant can use. Anything more will be wasted. So it's ramping up its photosynthesis production. It will require this much CO2 and this much nutrients to get 100% plant growth, meaning it'll grow really fast. What happens when we lower the lighting intensity? It simply lowers its production, thus lowering its need for CO2 and other nutrients. That in turn lowers the growth rate. The additional available CO2 and nutrients that we're providing is now wasted. But what happens if we give it enough light to, say, grow at this rate, and not give it enough nutrients it needs for that rate of growth? You're essentially starving the plant. It will stop growing or grow entirely slow. Your tank is suddenly full of excess nutrients. We can simply fix this by lowering the light intensity, or, just add CO2 and nutrients back into the tank. Now going further, let's assume our made-up plant requires a minimum of this much amount of light to grow. This is because of the location and the environment that it comes from, and it's adapted to millions of years of evolutions to grow this way. It needs the minimum of this amount of light to grow. Anything less, the plant will not survive. In this case, it doesn't matter how much CO2 or nutrients you give it, there is just no point. Now, some plants are just slow growers, and that's just the makeup of the plant itself. No matter how much light you give it, it can only grow so much. This is why, to make it easier for beginners or for people who just don't want to spend all their time maintaining their tank, it is suggested to stick with plants that require minimal lighting, because we can get away with the CO2 that's already in the tank or use cheaper and easier solutions to providing carbon to the plant. And of course, depending on the substrate you're using, you may not need or just need low nutrient dosing. Of course, to complicate matters, we're adding a whole bunch of plants to the aquarium that may have different requirements. In that case, we'll have to find the balance of what grows well together. If you watch some of my build videos and watch the updates thereafter, you'll see me take out some plants that just didn't fit. Sometimes I do it because I don't like how the colors mix together with other plants or how it grew in the tank itself. But there are times where the requirements for that plant is just so vastly different from the majority of what I was trying to grow. Sometimes to keep the harmony in the tank, we have to take the odd man out. So that is basic and a gist of how to balance a tank. Now, it's very important to also remember that we are balancing the tank to grow healthy plants, not to get rid of algae. That is the wrong way of thinking. So we'll have to go ahead and talk about preventing algae. And a lot of people ask me, well, how do you deal with algae? I simply say, I don't. I just create an environment where algae can't grow. And that basically means, and the simplest form of what you should be thinking about when talking about balanced tank is growing healthy plants. Do not worry about the algae. The algae will go away. Okay, if you're growing a very healthy tank with a lot of healthy growth of your plants, there will be no algae problem or very little algae problems. Now, when people ask me, well, how do you get rid of algae? Well, if it's a little algae, simple. I fix what's wrong with my tank. There's something off with the balance, so I will fix that. I'll either add a little more CO2, back off on the CO2, add a little more phosphates, or back up on the phosphates and the nutrients or iron or whatever, or I might raise the lighting or lower the lighting, okay? So again, a lot of things, especially in this example here that I'm about to give you, is one time I was getting a lot of hair algae. I couldn't figure out why. Why? When I figured it out was simply my CO2 was out of whack. Why was it out of whack? Well, because the diffuser was not working right. I fixed the diffuser problem. In a week or two, all the hair algae went away. And that, my friends, is balancing your tank. Finally, most important, and again, I cannot stress this enough, and I have mentioned it earlier in this video, is grow healthy plants. That should be your focus. Grow healthy plants. Do not focus on trying to get rid of algae. Rather than, if you do have algae, go move that focus over to how I could grow my plants healthier, how to make it thrive in growing, because something is messing it up, is causing the plants not to grow as well as it should. Thank you guys for watching, and remember, hit that like button as well as share where you can, and leave a comment down below and let me know what you think about this video. I love you guys. Remember, stay wet with your tanks and have fun. I'll see you in the next video.